courtroom buzzed with quiet chatter as people filled the seats. A high-profile case had brought reporters, legal experts, and curious spectators. Everyone knew this was going to be intense. At the defense table, a well-known lawyer adjusted his expensive suit. His name was Richard Steele, a man famous for never losing a case. His confidence filled the room. He smirked as he glanced at the prosecution's table. There stood Jordan Carter, a black prosecutor with a reputation for being sharp and relentless. He straightened his tie and organized his notes, unfazed by the weight of the case. He had prepared for months, and he knew the facts better than anyone. Richard chuckled, leaning toward his assistant. "They sent Carter against me?" he whispered. "This'll be over before lunch." His assistant hesitated but nodded. Steele's arrogance was legendary. He had been in the game for years and won cases with clever arguments and theatrics. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose. Once seated, the proceedings began. The air was thick with tension. Steele shot a glance at Carter, eyes full of amusement. "Hope you're ready, kid," he muttered. Carter didn't flinch. He had heard the whispers, the mockery, and the dismissive comments. But he wasn't here for approval. He was here to win. The jury members watched closely. Some had seen Steele dominate the courtroom before. Others were curious about Carter, the underdog in their eyes. As the judge called for opening statements, Steele leaned back in his chair. This was just another case to him, another easy win. But Carter knew better. This wasn't just about the law. This was about proving that skill, preparation, and truth mattered more than arrogance. Richard Steele stood up slowly, adjusting his suit with a smug grin. He walked to the center of the courtroom, making sure all eyes were on him. His confidence was impossible to ignore. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth and commanding. "This case is simple. My client is an honest businessman wrongly accused. The prosecution wants you to believe otherwise, but let's be honest." He paused, glancing at Jordan Carter. "We all know how these things go." A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. Some in the audience chuckled. The comment wasn't direct, but everyone understood the underlying tone. Carter remained still, his expression unreadable. Steele continued, walking toward the jury. "Now, I've been in this courtroom for years. I know how to separate fact from fiction. And I can tell you, this case, it's built on nothing." He turned to Carter, his smirk widening. "No offense, of course. I'm sure you've done your best." The condescending tone was clear. It wasn't the first time Steele had belittled an opponent, but this time, there was something extra in his voice. Something dismissive. Something that said he didn't see Carter as an equal. The judge cleared her throat. "Mr. Steele, let's keep it professional." "Of course, Your Honor," he said, bowing slightly. Then, as he returned to his seat, he muttered just loud enough, "Didn't know we were taking this one so seriously." Carter heard every word. The prosecutor didn't react. He didn't roll his eyes or shake his head. He simply took notes, his expression calm. Steele leaned back in his chair, pleased with himself. He had set the tone. He had made it clear who was in charge here. Or so he thought. Jordan Carter stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked toward the jury. His movements were calm, deliberate. He wasn't here for theatrics. He was here for the truth. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "You've heard the defense say this case is built on nothing, but I'm here to show you the facts." He placed a thick folder on the prosecution table, tapping it lightly. "This case isn't about opinions or clever words. It's about numbers, documents, and undeniable proof." Some jury members nodded slightly, leaning forward. Carter turned to face them. "The defendant, Mr. Henry Lawson, is accused of embezzling millions from his company. The evidence will show that money was moved into private accounts, hidden behind false transactions, and every single transfer leads back to him." Steele sighed loudly, shaking his head as if bored. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculation." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Overruled. The prosecution is laying out the facts." Carter didn't look at Steele. He continued, "We'll hear from forensic accountants who followed the money trail. We'll see email records, signed documents, and statements from employees who witnessed unusual activity." Steele yawned dramatically. "I can't wait," he muttered under his breath. Ignoring him, Carter picked up a document. "Here's an official transaction record, a transfer of $500,000 to a personal account." He held it up, signed by Mr. Lawson himself. The jury studied the paper closely as it was passed around. Some exchanged glances. Steele stood up suddenly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to show you how misleading all of this is. We'll prove that my client had no control over those transfers." Carter turned to him, finally meeting his gaze. "I look forward to hearing that explanation." Steele smirked, but said nothing. The judge motioned for the prosecution to continue. Carter walked back to his table unfazed. He knew Steele was trying to rattle him. But he wasn't here to play games. This was just the beginning. The courtroom settled as Jordan Carter stood again holding a stack of documents. His movements were precise, his expression calm. He wasn't here to argue, he was here to prove. "Let's talk about these transactions," he said, walking toward the witness stand. "Mr. Daniels, you're a forensic accountant. Can you tell the court what you found?" The witness nodded. "We traced multiple transactions from the company's accounts to offshore bank accounts. Each transfer was authorized under Mr. Lawson's credentials." Carter nodded. "And did anyone else have access to those credentials?" "No," Daniels said, "only Mr. Lawson." A few jurors shifted. The evidence was clear. Richard Steele stood quickly. "Objection. Just because a transaction is under someone's name doesn't mean they made it." Carter turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'll prove that Mr. Lawson was fully aware of these transactions." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Carter pulled up an email. "Here's an internal message from Mr. Lawson to his accountant. It says," he looked at the paper, "move the funds before the audit." A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Steele's smirk faded for a second, but he quickly regained his composure. That email could mean anything. Carter walked toward the jury. "The prosecution will show that every transaction was deliberate. Every movement of money was planned. And every attempt to hide it was intentional." He turned to the witness. "Did you find any signs that someone else was controlling these accounts?" Daniels shook his head. "No. All login records trace back to Mr. Lawson." Carter paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the room. Steele stood up, straightening his tie. "All right," he said, smirking. "Then let's really talk about what happened." Carter returned to his seat, watching as Steele prepared his response. The real battle was just beginning. Richard Steele stood up, forcing a confident smile. He straightened his tie, walked to the center of the courtroom, and turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, chuckling slightly, "let's not get carried away. An email? A few transactions? That doesn't prove guilt." He paced in front of the jury, shaking his head as if the whole situation was ridiculous. "People send messages all the time. Move the funds before the audit. That could mean 100 different things." But the jury didn't laugh. They were no longer as relaxed as they had been earlier. Carter remained seated, silently watching. He didn't need to interrupt. The evidence was already speaking for itself. Steele cleared his throat and turned back to the witness. "Mr. Daniels, you're an accountant. Isn't it possible these transactions were simply accounting errors?" Daniels shook his head. "Not at this scale. These were deliberate transfers designed to look like routine business expenses." Steele's smile twitched, but he kept going. "But you can't say with absolute certainty that my client personally moved the money, can you?" Daniels hesitated. "The login credentials and signatures all match his." A few jurors took notes. Steele clenched his jaw slightly. His usual tricks weren't working. He turned to Carter. "All right, Mr. Prosecutor, you think you've got it all figured out. But tell me this, where's the motive?" Carter stood up calmly. "Greed. Mr. Lawson stole millions while his employees struggled, and when the company started investigating, he covered his tracks." Steele scoffed. "That's just a theory." Carter lifted another document. "This is a resignation letter from Mr. Lawson's accountant, sent the day after the money vanished. She wrote, 'I can't be part of this anymore.'" The room fell silent. Steele's confidence wavered. He knew he was losing ground. He sat down quickly, gripping his pen. Carter looked at the jury, his expression steady. "The facts are clear." For the first time, Steele had nothing to say. The courtroom was silent as the judge turned to the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" A middle-aged woman in the front row, the jury foreperson, stood up and cleared her throat. "We have, Your Honor." Richard Steele sat stiffly, gripping the edge of the defense table. His client, Henry Lawson, shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. Jordan Carter remained calm, his hands folded neatly in front of him. The judge nodded. Please read the verdict. The foreperson unfolded a piece of paper. On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendant. She paused, glancing at the jury members. Guilty. A hushed murmur spread through the room. Steele's jaw tightened. His client exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Carter remained expressionless. He had expected this. The evidence was undeniable. The judge's gavel struck. Mr. Lawson, you've been found guilty. Sentencing will take place in a separate hearing. She turned to the prosecution. Mr. Carter, excellent presentation of the case. Carter nodded respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. Steele slowly leaned back in his chair, his usual arrogance gone. For the first time in a long time he had lost. He turned to Carter, narrowing his eyes. Don't let this win go to your head, he muttered under his breath. Carter simply gathered his papers. It was never about winning, it was about the truth. Steele had no response. As the courtroom emptied, reporters rushed forward, eager to speak to Carter. The judge stood, signaling the official end of the trial. Steele remained seated for a moment, staring at the defense table. The confidence, the jokes, the arrogance, it had all meant nothing in the face of real evidence. He finally stood and walked out, avoiding the eyes of the man he had mocked. Carter didn't watch him leave. He was already focused on his next case. The courtroom emptied as people whispered about the shocking verdict. Reporters gathered near the exit, waiting to question the attorneys. Jordan Carter packed his briefcase with quiet efficiency. He had done his job, and justice had been served, but there was no need to celebrate. This was what he had prepared for. Richard Steele stood near the defense table, staring at nothing in particular. The usual smirk was gone. His client had already been escorted out, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Carter walked past him without a word, but just before reaching the door, Steele spoke. "You got lucky," he muttered. His voice lacked its usual confidence. Carter stopped, but didn't turn around. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment. Then with a calm voice, he replied, "Luck had nothing to do with it." Steele said nothing. He knew it was true. As Carter stepped outside, cameras flashed and microphones were pushed toward him. A reporter asked, "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to win against one of the best defense attorneys in the state?" Carter adjusted his tie. "This case was never about me, it was about the evidence." Another reporter asked, "Any words for Mr. Steele?" Carter glanced back at the courthouse doors. He's a skilled lawyer, but the truth wins in the end. Without another word, he walked away, leaving behind the noise and attention. Inside the courthouse, Steele sat down, rubbing his temple. He had underestimated Carter. He had let his arrogance blind him, and now, for the first time in years, he had to face the fact that he wasn't unbeatable.